In a quiet suburban neighborhood, two elderly black homeowners tried to live out their golden years in peace. But under the blazing sun of everyday life, a single figure turned that dream into a nightmare. The head of the Homeowners Association, known by many as the neighborhood Karen, wielded her power like a weapon, targeting the couple with endless fines, threats, and racially charged harassment. From their front yard to their very mailbox, no detail was safe from her scrutiny. What she didn't know was that her cruelty would awaken a reckoning she never expected, because the couple's grandson, a disciplined Army veteran, was on his way home. The neighborhood looked picture-perfect in the daylight: neatly trimmed lawns, fresh paint on every house, and a quiet calm broken only by the sound of sprinklers ticking in the distance. For years, James and Loretta Walker had taken pride in their modest home at the end of the cul-de-sac. They were among the first black families to move into the area decades ago, raising their children there and later welcoming grandkids for summers filled with barbecues and laughter. At their age, the Walkers wanted only peace, a safe home where they could sip sweet tea on the porch and enjoy the warmth of retirement. But the Homeowners Association, under the iron fist of its president, a woman everyone whispered about as Karen, saw them differently. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for only a handful of years, yet she carried herself as if she owned every street, every hedge, every square inch of property. With her clipboard in hand and a scowl permanently etched across her face, she patrolled during the day, scanning for violations. To most residents, it was an inconvenience, an occasional warning about a misplaced trash can or grass cut half an inch too long. But for the Walkers, it became something darker. Karen targeted them relentlessly. A flower pot on the porch was suddenly not HOA approved. A small chip in their paint earned them a threatening letter. Even the shade tree that had stood in their yard for decades was called a hazard. Neighbors glanced away, too afraid or too indifferent to intervene. Day by day, the Walkers found their joy chipped away, replaced by exhaustion and quiet humiliation. And while they tried to endure with dignity, the constant harassment carried an unmistakable undertone, one rooted not in rules, but in race. Karen's gaze lingered on them longer, her tone sharper, her punishments harsher. What might have been petty to others cut deep for the Walkers, reopening wounds they thought the world had left behind. The sun rose each day over the cul-de-sac, but for James and Loretta Walker, daylight meant another round of scrutiny. Karen's silver SUV would roll slowly past their home, her eyes scanning every inch like a hawk circling prey. She seemed to live for these patrols, and every time she stopped at their address, a new notice followed. It began with the flower pots, brightly painted ceramic pots that Loretta loved, a splash of color against their porch. A letter arrived claiming they violated uniform aesthetic guidelines. When Loretta replaced them with plain terracotta, Karen appeared days later, measuring them with a tape measure in broad daylight. Soon after came the lawn accusations, grass deemed overgrown, though theirs was no different from neighbors' yards. James had to mow twice a week, his aging knees groaning, just to avoid fines, but the harassment only sharpened. One afternoon, Loretta stepped outside to find a bright orange sticker plastered across their mailbox, non-compliant. Karen insisted it wasn't the approved style, even though the Walkers had installed it decades before, the same as others on the street. When Loretta protested, Karen smirked and warned, "The HOA has the power to take legal action." Behind the smile, the message was clear. She wanted them gone. It wasn't just the rules, it was the way she lingered outside their home, clipboard in hand, muttering as she snapped photos. Other residents received warnings now and then, but never with the same hostility. Karen's voice carried just loud enough when she muttered words like standards and certain people don't belong. Loretta felt the sting of those words deep in her chest. The Walkers' friends urged them to ignore her, to let it go. But letting it go wasn't easy when Karen seemed determined to strip away their dignity. At night, James lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if their dream of retiring peacefully in that house was fading. Loretta, once vibrant and social, now hesitated to leave the porch, afraid of another confrontation. Days turned into weeks, and the pressure mounted. Karen escalated her campaign with threats of fines, escalating to talk of foreclosure if violations weren't corrected. The Walkers had lived there for decades, paid off their mortgage, contributed to the community, and yet here was this woman, newly arrived, threatening to erase it all with a stroke of her pen. But life has a way of shifting at the most unexpected moments. While Karen tightened her grip, a quiet development unfolded far beyond the cul-de-sac. Their grandson, Marcus, was on his way home. A decorated Army sergeant, Marcus had spent years overseas in service of a country his grandparents had taught him to love despite its flaws. To James and Loretta, Marcus wasn't just family. He was a source of pride, resilience, and hope. They didn't want to burden him with Karen's cruelty, but word had a way of spreading. A concerned neighbor, one of the few who still whispered support from the shadows, had written to Marcus, telling him what was happening at his grandparents' home. And Marcus, tired from deployments but filled with loyalty, made a decision. He would come home, not just to rest, but to stand beside the people who had raised him. Karen had no idea her reign of intimidation was about to meet a force she could not measure with a clipboard or silence with a fine. The day Marcus returned was bright, the kind of afternoon where the sun painted every roof and driveway in gold. James and Loretta sat quietly on their porch, exhaustion etched across their faces. Another notice had arrived that morning, this time threatening legal action if violations weren't addressed within 2 weeks. It felt like the end of the road. Then the sound of boots on the driveway. Loretta looked up, and there he was, her grandson, broad-shouldered in his army fatigues, posture straight as steel. Marcus embraced his grandparents, but as he did, his sharp eyes caught the orange violation sticker still stuck to the mailbox. His jaw tightened. As if on cue, Karen's silver SUV rolled to a slow stop in front of the Walkers' home. She stepped out with her ever-present clipboard, sunglasses glinting in the daylight. With deliberate steps, she marched toward the porch. "There are still unresolved issues," she announced coldly, eyes darting past James and Loretta to land on Marcus. "If this continues, the HOA will take action." Marcus stepped forward, his shadow falling across the porch. He said nothing, but his presence carried a weight far heavier than words. His uniform spoke for him. Years of discipline, sacrifice, and service. Karen faltered for the first time, her lips tightening as she shifted her clipboard. Marcus calmly pulled the violation notice from his grandmother's hands and held it up. His eyes, steady and unflinching, locked on Karen's. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, sensing something different in the air. Karen tried to recover her composure, but her voice wavered as she insisted, "Rules are rules. Everyone must comply." Still, Marcus didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calm stare carried the weight of every injustice his grandparents had endured, of every insult left unspoken but deeply felt. It was the kind of stare that reminded Karen she wasn't just dealing with a quiet elderly couple anymore. That day, the balance of power shifted. For the first time, Karen realized she couldn't bully her way through. The Walkers were no longer standing alone. The standoff on that sunny afternoon became a turning point. Karen, rattled by Marcus's unshakable presence, backed away with a stiff nod, retreating to her SUV. But word spread quickly. Neighbors who had stayed silent began murmuring. Some ashamed, others emboldened by what they'd witnessed. For years they had watched Karen wield her power unchecked. Now they saw someone who wasn't afraid to stand tall against her. Marcus didn't stop at intimidation. He spent the next week documenting every notice, every baseless fine, every inconsistency between how his grandparents were treated and how others were left alone. With military precision, he organized evidence into binders and reached out to legal aid groups who specialized in housing discrimination. What Karen thought would be brushed off as just HOA rules was exposed for what it really was: targeted harassment with racial undertones. At the next HOA board meeting, Marcus attended with his grandparents seated proudly beside him. The room wasn't crowded, but the atmosphere was electric. Karen sat at the head, attempting to keep her composure. But as Marcus calmly laid out the evidence, page after page, her authority crumbled. The board members, many of whom had previously deferred to her, shifted uncomfortably. The facts were undeniable. The bias was clear. By the end of the meeting, Karen was stripped of her position. The HOA issued an apology to James and Loretta, promising changes to prevent abuse of power. It wasn't just a personal victory. It was a statement to the entire community that silence in the face of injustice only empowers the bully. For James and Loretta, the weight they had carried for months finally lifted. Their porch, once a place of dread, became once again a place of peace. And as they sat there, with Marcus beside them, the neighborhood felt different, brighter, safer, more just, not because racism had disappeared, but because it had been confronted, and that raises the question. In our own neighborhoods, workplaces, and communities, how often do we let injustice slide by in silence? And what might change if, like Marcus, we chose to stand?